The city was quiet that night, cloaked in the gentle hum of distant traffic and the occasional chirp of a street lamp struggling against the darkness. For Officer Greg Turner, it was just another routine shift in a neighborhood he believed he understood all too well. He cruised through the dimly lit streets, his patrol car reflecting the pale glow of neon signs flickering from shuttered shops. The radio on his dashboard buzzed faintly with updates from dispatch, but his mind was elsewhere, lost in the monotony of his routine and the prejudices he carried like an old badge. Greg spotted her at the corner of 9th and Maple, standing near a parked car. A black woman in her late 30s, dressed in a tailored leather jacket and dark jeans, appeared to be scanning her phone. To most, she wouldn't seem out of place, just another person minding her business in the night. But to Greg, her presence seemed suspicious. His instincts, as he liked to call them, were already whispering assumptions. He pulled his car over, the red and blue lights casting distorted shadows on the brick walls of the narrow street. "Evening," he said gruffly as he stepped out, his hand resting on the belt where his radio and handcuffs dangled. The woman looked up, her expression calm but unreadable. "Good evening, officer," she replied, her voice steady, almost too composed for his liking. She tucked her phone into her pocket and folded her arms, standing her ground. Greg's eyes narrowed. "What are you doing out here this late?" he asked, his tone sharp enough to cut through the quiet. "Just waiting for someone," she said simply. There was no hesitation in her words, no stammering or defensiveness, which only irritated him further. He had encountered too many people who fumbled for excuses. Her calmness felt like defiance. "Waiting for who?" he pressed, stepping closer, his boots crunching against the asphalt. Her eyes met his, steady and unflinching. "A friend," she said. "Is there a problem, officer?" Greg hated that question. The challenge it implied, the nerve of someone questioning his authority. He didn't respond right away, letting the silence hang heavy between them. He studied her face, her posture, searching for something, anything that would justify his growing suspicion. "License and ID," he finally said, holding out a hand. The woman raised an eyebrow but didn't argue. She reached into her pocket slowly, retrieving a sleek wallet. Greg watched her every move, his tension visible in the way his hand hovered near his holster. She handed over a driver's license and a federal ID card, which he snatched without a word. Greg glanced at the ID, expecting to see something mundane, maybe a local address or an expired card he could use as leverage. But what he saw made his pulse quicken. The seal of the Central Intelligence Agency gleamed faintly under the dim streetlight, and beneath it, her name, Jasmine Monroe. For a split second, he hesitated. His mind scrambled to process what he was holding, but his pride, his deeply ingrained prejudices, wouldn't let him back down so easily. "This a fake?" he asked, his voice harsher now, tinged with disbelief. Jasmine didn't flinch. "No, officer, it's not." Her tone carried the faintest edge of warning, a subtle reminder that she wasn't someone to be trifled with. But Greg wasn't ready to let it go. He handed the ID back with a dismissive scoff. "Stay right here," he ordered before turning toward his patrol car to run her information. Inside the car, his hands shook slightly as he typed her name into the database. Part of him wanted her story to check out, wanted her to be who she claimed, just so he could walk away from this encounter with his ego intact. But another part of him hoped he'd find a discrepancy, a reason to arrest her and assert his authority. The screen loaded, and Greg's heart sank. Her credentials were genuine. Jasmine Monroe was not just a CIA agent, a high-ranking operative with clearance levels he couldn't even begin to comprehend. He stared at the screen, the weight of his mistake pressing down on him. As he stepped out of the car, his expression carefully neutral, Jasmine was already watching him, her arms still crossed, her gaze as calm and unyielding as ever. "Everything check out, officer?" she asked, her voice carrying just enough steel to let him know she was fully aware of what he had been thinking. Greg didn't answer right away. His pride, his years of believing he could do no wrong in his position, wouldn't let him apologize. Instead, he mumbled something about her being free to go and turned back toward his car. But as he reached for the door handle, Jasmine spoke again. "Officer Turner," she said, her voice sharper now. He turned back to face her, and for the first time he noticed the faint smirk tugging at the corner of her lips. "You might want to reconsider how you approach people in the future. Some of us are watching." Greg felt his stomach churn. He didn't respond, didn't trust himself to say anything that wouldn't dig him deeper into the hole he had already made. As he drove away, his mind raced with a mixture of anger, embarrassment, and a creeping realization that he might have just made a very dangerous enemy. Jasmine watched the patrol car disappear into the night, a calm demeanor slipping just slightly as she exhaled deeply. She pulled out her phone and made a call. "It's me," she said softly. "We might have a problem. He's not the only one out here like that." The voice on the other end replied, and Jasmine's expression hardened. "No, I don't think he knows who he just messed with, but he's about to find out." Jasmine ended the call and slipped her phone back into her pocket, the faint buzz of the city filling the silence around her. She glanced at her car parked a few feet away, the sleek black vehicle blending into the shadows. Her mind was already working through the encounter, dissecting every word, every gesture. This wasn't the first time she dealt with someone like Officer Turner, and she knew it wouldn't be the last. But tonight felt different. His reaction, the way he clung to his assumptions even after seeing her credentials, hinted at something deeper, something darker. Sliding into the driver's seat, Jasmine adjusted her rearview mirror. The faint scent of leather filled the car as she started the engine, the low hum barely audible. She took a moment to steady herself, her fingers gripping the steering wheel tightly. It wasn't fear coursing through her veins. It was anger, not just at Turner, but at the system that allowed people like him to operate unchecked. It was exhausting, fighting battles that never seemed to end, but Jasmine had never been one to back down. As she drove through the city, her thoughts drifted to the case that had brought her here in the first place. Officially, she was on leave, taking a much-needed break after a grueling overseas operation. Unofficially, she was chasing a lead that had landed far too close to home. A series of unexplained disappearances in the area had caught her attention, and despite her superiors advising her to step back, Jasmine couldn't ignore the nagging feeling that something was off. The victims were all young black men and women, and the police had done little more than file the reports and move on. To Jasmine, it felt like pieces of a puzzle no one else wanted to solve. Her contact at the agency had been reluctant to share details, but Jasmine had her ways. She knew there were whispers of a group operating in the shadows, targeting vulnerable communities under the guise of law enforcement. The deeper she dug, the murkier it became, and tonight's encounter with Turner only added to her suspicions. Was he just another cog in the machine, or was he part of something bigger? Jasmine pulled into the driveway of a modest suburban house, its white picket fence and neatly trimmed lawn almost too perfect. It was the kind of place that screamed normalcy, a stark contrast to the chaos she often found herself navigating. She stepped out of the car, her boots crunching against the gravel, and made her way to the front door. Before she could knock, the door swung open, revealing a tall man with salt and pepper hair and a weary expression. "Jasmine," he said, stepping aside to let her in. "You're late." "Traffic," she replied, though they both knew it was a lie. She had purposely taken her time, needing a moment to collect her thoughts after the run-in with Turner. She followed him into the living room, where a stack of files sat on the coffee table, each one marked with a case number. The man, Agent Marcus Daniels, had been her mentor when she first joined the agency. Now semi-retired, he acted as her unofficial confidant, someone she could trust when things got too complicated. He gestured for her to sit, his eyes scanning her face. "You look like you've had a night," he said, handing her a cup of coffee. "You could say that," Jasmine replied, taking a sip. The bitterness grounded her, giving her a moment to think. "Ran into a cop tonight. Turner, he pulled me over for no reason." Marcus raised an eyebrow. "What happened?" She recounted the encounter, her voice steady but laced with frustration. Marcus listened intently, his expression darkening as she spoke. "Turner's name has come up before," he said when she finished. "He's been flagged in a few complaints, but nothing ever sticks. People like him know how to play the system." Jasmine nodded, her jaw tightening. "He didn't back down, even after seeing my ID. Either he's incredibly reckless, or he's got something, or someone, protecting him." Marcus leaned back in his chair, his fingers tapping against the armrest. "You think he's connected to the disappearances?" "I don't know," Jasmine admitted. "But my gut tells me he's not just some overzealous cop. There's more to this." Marcus studied her for a moment before reaching for one of the files on the table. He handed it to her, his expression grim. "This might help. It's everything we've got on the disappearances so far. Not much, but it's a start." Jasmine opened the file, her eyes scanning the pages. Photos of smiling faces stared back at her, each one accompanied by a brief summary of their last known whereabouts. The pattern was subtle but undeniable. Each victim had been stopped by the police shortly before vanishing. The reports were vague, the details sparse, but one thing was clear: these weren't isolated incidents. As Jasmine flipped through the file, a thought struck her. What about body cam footage? anything from the officers involved. Marcus shook his head. Conveniently missing or malfunctioning in every case, and the department isn't exactly cooperative when it comes to sharing information. Jasmine sighed, closing the file. Of course not. They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of the situation pressing down on them. Jasmine could feel the familiar pull of frustration and determination, the same drive that had kept her going through countless missions. This wasn't just about the victims. It was about the system that allowed their stories to be erased, their lives reduced to statistics. I need to know who Turner reports to, she said finally. I need to know what they're hiding. Marcus nodded. I'll see what I can dig up. But be careful, Jasmine. If you're right about this, you're stepping into something big. I know, she replied, her voice firm. But someone has to. As she left Marcus's house and climbed back into her car, Jasmine couldn't shake the feeling that time was running out. The pieces were starting to come together, but the picture they painted was darker than she had anticipated. And somewhere in the city, Officer Greg Turner was likely telling himself that tonight had been just another routine stop. But Jasmine knew better. She knew that the truth had a way of surfacing, no matter how deeply it was buried. She started the engine, the sound cutting through the stillness of the night. As she pulled onto the road, her phone buzzed with a message. Glancing at the screen, her heart skipped a beat. The message was simple but chilling. They know you're here. Jasmine gripped the wheel tighter, her mind racing. Whoever had sent the message wasn't just warning her, they were watching her. And if they knew she was here, it meant the game she was playing was about to get a whole lot more dangerous. Jasmine's heart raced as the message lingered on her screen. She quickly deleted it, her instincts kicking in. Whoever had sent it was either an ally warning her or an enemy trying to rattle her. Either way, it meant her cover was thinner than she thought. She took a deep breath and tightened her grip on the steering wheel, her mind running through the possibilities. Someone was watching, and she needed to find out who. Driving through the city, she kept an eye on her mirrors, scanning for anything unusual. A car that turned when she did. Headlights that stayed too close for too long. The streets blurred together under the soft glow of streetlights as she mentally mapped out her next steps. The lead she'd been following was no longer just about solving a mystery. It was personal now. She pulled into an empty parking lot behind a 24-hour diner, the kind of place where no one asked questions. The neon sign buzzed faintly above her, casting a flickering light onto the asphalt. Jasmine grabbed her laptop from the passenger seat and slipped into the diner, her movements cautious but purposeful. The bell over the door jingled as she entered, drawing a quick glance from the waitress behind the counter. Jasmine gave her a polite nod before sliding into a booth near the back. Opening her laptop, she connected to a secure network, her fingers flying across the keyboard. She pulled up everything she could find on Officer Greg Turner, digging deeper than before. What she found only confirmed her suspicions. Multiple complaints filed against him, all involving excessive force or racial profiling, and all mysteriously dismissed. There were connections to other officers with similar complaints, their names showing up in patterns that were too consistent to be coincidence. And then there were the disappearances. Each victim had crossed paths with at least one of these officers before vanishing. Jasmine frowned, her mind piecing together a web that stretched farther than she'd expected. This wasn't just about Greg Turner. It was about a network, a group operating under the radar, using their badges as shields. And she had a sinking feeling that they weren't working alone. Her thoughts were interrupted by the soft chime of her phone. She glanced at the screen to see a new message. Check your 6. Her blood ran cold. She looked up, her eyes scanning the diner. It was mostly empty, just the waitress wiping down the counter and a man in a corner booth staring at his coffee. But there was someone new. A man sitting 2 booths behind her, his face partially obscured by a baseball cap. He hadn't been there when she came in. Jasmine's training kicked in. She forced herself to stay calm, her movements casual as she closed her laptop and slipped it back into her bag. She reached for her coffee, taking a slow sip while watching the man's reflection in the chrome napkin holder on her table. He wasn't looking at her directly, but his posture, the way his hand rested near his pocket, screamed of someone who wasn't just there for the late-night pancakes. Sliding out of the booth, Jasmine approached the counter, her footsteps deliberate. "Excuse me," she said to the waitress, keeping her voice steady. "Is there a back exit?" The waitress looked up, startled. Yeah, through the kitchen. But customers aren't supposed to." "Thanks," Jasmine said, slipping a 20 onto the counter before heading toward the kitchen door. She could feel the man's eyes on her now, his movements subtle but telling. He was getting up. As soon as she was through the door, she picked up her pace, weaving through the cluttered kitchen until she found the back exit. Pushing it open, she stepped into the cool night air, the alley behind the diner eerily quiet. A car was parked a block away, too far to reach without being seen. She pressed herself against the wall, her breath steadying as she listened for footsteps. They came seconds later, slow and deliberate. The man had followed her, his silhouette appearing at the mouth of the alley. He paused, his head turning as he scanned the shadows. Jasmine stayed still, her body tense as she calculated her next move. "Jasmine Monroe," he called out, his voice low but carrying an edge. "You've been asking the wrong questions." She didn't respond, her mind racing. If he knew her name, he wasn't just some random thug. He was connected to this, and he had come to send a message, or worse. "Come out and we can talk," he said, taking a step forward. "You don't want this to get messy." Jasmine's hand moved to her pocket, her fingers closing around the small canister of pepper spray she always carried. It wasn't much, but it was enough to buy her time. She waited until he was closer, his figure more defined in the dim light. "Last chance," he said, his tone shifting to impatience. Jasmine moved quickly, stepping out of the shadows and spraying him directly in the face. He staggered back, cursing loudly as he clawed at his eyes. Not wasting a second, Jasmine took off down the alley, her footsteps echoing against the walls. She darted around the corner and sprinted toward her car, her heart pounding. As she reached the driver's side door, she glanced back to see the man still struggling, his shouts muffled by the distance. Sliding into the car, she started the engine and pulled away, her hands trembling on the wheel. She didn't relax until she was several blocks away, the adrenaline still coursing through her veins. Pulling into a dimly lit parking garage, Jasmine parked in a far corner and shut off the engine. She sat there for a moment, her breathing heavy as she processed what had just happened. Whoever that man was, he had made one thing clear: she was getting too close to something dangerous. Reaching for her phone, she dialed Marcus's number. He answered on the second ring, his voice tinged with concern. "Jasmine, what's going on?" "They know," she said, her voice steady despite the chaos in her mind. "Someone just tried to follow me. He knew my name." There was a pause on the other end, and then Marcus spoke, his tone grim. "You need to disappear for a while. Lay low until we figure this out." "I can't," Jasmine replied firmly. "If I back off now, they'll win, and more people will get hurt." "Jasmine," Marcus said, his voice carrying a rare note of urgency. "This isn't just about the disappearances anymore. If they know who you are, they'll come after you with everything they've got. You can't fight this alone." "I'm not backing down," she said, her resolve unshaken. "We're closer than ever. I just need to find the missing piece." Marcus sighed heavily, but he didn't argue. "Fine, but promise me you'll be careful. And if anything feels off, you call me. Understand?" "Understood," Jasmine said, though she knew she couldn't make any guarantees. As she hung up, she leaned back in her seat, her eyes scanning the darkness of the parking garage. The shadows felt heavier now, the silence more oppressive. She wasn't just up against a corrupt network or a group of rogue officers. She was up against something much bigger, something that thrived in the darkness. And she had no intention of letting it win. Jasmine sat in the silence of her car, the weight of the night pressing down on her. Every instinct told her to stop, to walk away before she got pulled even deeper. But she couldn't ignore the faces of the victims she'd seen in the files, their lives cut short, their families left with no answers. She had made a promise to herself when she joined the CIA to seek justice, no matter the cost. Her phone buzzed, breaking her thoughts. It was a text from Marcus. The message was brief but urgent. "Found something. Warehouse on 12th and Pine. Be careful." Jasmine stared at the words, her pulse quickening. A warehouse? It sounded like the kind of place where loose ends were tied up permanently. But if Marcus had sent her there, it meant it was important. She took a deep breath, started the car, and pulled out of the parking garage, her mind racing with possibilities. The streets were eerily quiet as she approached the warehouse district. Rows of abandoned buildings loomed in the darkness, their broken windows and faded paint giving them a haunted appearance. Jasmine parked a block away and moved on foot, her steps light against the cracked pavement. She kept to the shadows, her eyes scanning every corner for movement. When she reached the warehouse, she crouched behind a stack of old shipping pallets and took in her surroundings. The building was massive, its corrugated metal exterior reflecting the faint light of a flickering street lamp. A single car was parked near the entrance, its engine off but its presence troubling. Jasmine couldn't shake the feeling she was walking into a trap, but she didn't have the luxury of second-guessing. She crept closer, her heart pounding with every step. The faint hum of voices reached her ears, muffled but distinct. Peering through a cracked window, she saw two men standing near a table piled with documents and what looked like surveillance equipment. One of them was Greg Turner. He looked as smug as ever, his posture relaxed as he gestured toward the table. The other man was older, with a sharp suit and a demeanor that radiated authority. Jasmine didn't recognize him, but something about him screamed power. Their conversation was low, but Jasmine caught fragments of it. Words like cleanup, liabilities, and payment hung in the air, their implications chilling. Jasmine's stomach twisted as she realized the depth of the operation. This wasn't just about rogue cops. This was organized, calculated, and well-funded. She pulled out her phone, snapping photos through the window. Every piece of evidence counted, and she wasn't about to leave empty-handed. But as she adjusted her angle for a better shot, her elbow brushed against a loose piece of wood. The sound was faint, but it was enough. Greg's head snapped toward the window, his expression shifting to one of suspicion. Jasmine froze, her breath caught in her throat. He stepped closer, his eyes narrowing as he scanned the darkness outside. Jasmine flattened herself against the wall, her mind racing for a way out. "I thought I heard something," Greg said, his voice loud enough for her to hear. "You're paranoid," the other man replied dismissively. "Focus, we've got bigger problems." Greg hesitated, then turned back to the table. Jasmine exhaled quietly, relief washing over her. But her relief was short-lived. She had to get out of there before her luck ran out. She moved carefully, her steps deliberate as she made her way back toward the street. But as she rounded the corner of the building, she came face to face with someone she hadn't seen before. He was tall and broad-shouldered, his expression hard as he blocked her path. "Lost?" he asked, his tone mocking. Jasmine didn't hesitate. She spun on her heel and sprinted in the opposite direction, her heart pounding in her chest. Shouts erupted behind her, the man calling for backup. She zigzagged through the maze of buildings, her breath coming in sharp bursts as she searched for an escape route. Ahead, she spotted an open door to another warehouse. She darted inside, her footsteps echoing in the cavernous space. The building was filled with rusted machinery and towering stacks of wooden crates, providing plenty of places to hide. She slipped behind a large piece of equipment, her body pressed against the cold metal as she tried to steady her breathing. The sound of footsteps grew louder, the men spreading out as they searched for her. Jasmine clenched her fists, her mind racing through her options. She was outnumbered and outgunned, but she wasn't out of the fight. She just needed a plan. One of the men passed by her hiding spot, his flashlight sweeping across the floor. Jasmine waited until he moved on, then slipped out and crept toward the exit. But as she reached the door, she felt a hand grab her arm. She spun around, her instincts kicking in as she delivered a swift kick to the man's knee. He stumbled, cursing, but didn't go down. Jasmine bolted, her adrenaline surging as she ran into the night. She didn't stop until she reached her car, her chest heaving as she fumbled for her keys. As she drove away, her mind was a whirlwind of thoughts. She had seen enough to confirm her suspicions, but she still didn't have the full picture. And now they knew she was onto them. The warehouse faded into the distance, but the danger felt closer than ever. Jasmine gripped the steering wheel, her resolve hardening. She wasn't just chasing justice anymore, she was fighting for her survival. And she wasn't about to back down.